on the ground was a copy of your book, paperback copy of your book, Illusions. The cover was torn off, it had been thrown away. And I reached for it, and it opened at a certain point. And what I read radically changed my life. This is my choice. I have made all the decisions that led me here, and I have the power to make the decisions that will lead me away. And that had happened years before, and he somehow got a grip on his life and become a successful business person, and finally decided to write me that story. And that was so touching. And because I knew similar things have happened to me. I've been at very difficult times in my life, and then I read a book, and it gets to the point where I can open a book at random, and wham, there's something that's very important for me. So after Seagull came out, a number of people told me, you should really be reading this book. It's called Seth Speaks by Jane Roberts. I said, yeah. Then another person would say, you ever heard of a book called Seth Speak? And I said, somebody recommended it. Yeah. Then I was in New York in this huge secondhand bookstore, and as I'm walking down the aisle, way up on a shelf over my head, there was a book that was about ready to fall. Somebody had put it back in, but it was still like 3 inches coming out over I was going to fall on somebody. So I reached up to put it back in, and it was Seth Speaks. It was that book.
Wow.
Hey! And I opened the book. My test for any book is I open it at random 3 times. And if it catches me every time, intensely, 3 times, bam, 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 I buy the book.
Sounds like the I Ching.
Yes, very much like the I Ching, yes. And that was a wonderful book, and started a whole conversation with Jane Roberts, the author, and her husband, Rob Butts, and a good friendship and a wonderful experience with this strange character called Seth. So I think books, if we want them to be, books are guideposts in our life, and they tell us, here's what another human being did in this situation. Here's what someone else thinks and feels. It doesn't matter if they're fiction or nonfiction. How does it apply to my life? And certain books can say, this absolutely applies to your life. Listen up. And I think many of us have that same thing. Something really touches us and says, that's me. That writer is writing about me. He's writing about my past and my future, what could be my future. And that's magical stuff. I love to be involved in a kind of business that involves the exchange of ideas that can change people's lives, mine included.
In the big change in the publishing industry, the fact that we can create books on demand has changed the landscape of actualizing a book.
Yes.
For many writers that may have been rejected by many publishers and may be fed up and want to dress their book, package it in a certain way, a certain look, want to name it and put it out there and then let it fly. What do you think of that?
I think it's wonderful. It opens the door, as you said, for many, many writers who can now say, I'll make the book exactly the way I want it to be, and then I will see if I can put it on the web or something like that. But a lot of books now come through publishers after having been published first on their own, and then a publisher gets this thing, and the writer says, I've sold 3,000 copies of this on the web. Don't you think you might be interested in this? And the publisher said, absolutely. So a number of books have come that way, and some have been bestsellers too. Yeah, I think that opens the door a little bit wider. It used to be that you just had to just slog through these difficult times, and now you can see that book published. I used to imagine, when I was writing a book, I would imagine it finished, and there it is sitting on my shelf, and I would kind of hold this thought, and as I wrote, that became truer and truer. But now you can actually do that.
And you can do covers and see it and imagine it. Do you usually see the name of your book, or do you find you get to that after it's all written?
Afterwards, almost invariably afterwards. It'll jump out in some sentence, in some cases, the last sentence in the book. Stranger to the Ground, for instance, my first book. I didn't know what the title of that was going to be, but there it was suddenly in the very last page, and I think it was the last sentence or the second to last sentence. It was the last sentence. Wham! There was the title of the book. So I don't worry about titles anymore. They will come to me somehow, and
that requires tremendous trust in terms of your own being as an instrument, right?
That is the experience of a writer. You must trust. You don't have to know in advance how everything's going to work out. You don't know how. You have to know what the end of this sentence is going to be. Just keep writing. It will take care of itself. And the same thing for the sale of a book. And I've had the whole thing. I've had very, very difficult times. There's a kind of fakery that used to exist, and to some extent still does, in the publishing world. It used to be that if no one had heard your name, they wouldn't read your book, even though it might have been a beautiful book. You had to just fight to even get it read. And then that fakery turns around. If you've had a couple of bestsellers, then they'll print anything you write just because they know your name. And you have to be careful for that too, Make sure that as a writer, you love the book. If you don't write it, do not offer it to anybody, because if they accept it, it's going to be out there, and you won't like it, and your name will be on it. And that's not good. I have done that with magazine articles. When I worked for a magazine, that I had to write some stories that I really didn't like. They were just very nuts and bolts, run-of-the-mill things, and I would use a pseudonym, a different name when that article was published. But even today, I'm the only one in the world who knows that I wrote these boring stories, these boring articles. They're out there, but fortunately, nobody else in the world knows it.
You're funny. You're very funny. Have you always had a good sense of humor?
I think as a writer, you kind of have to.
You sound like you deal with a lot of irony really well.
Well, yeah, that happens. You do need that. You do need the perspective of being able to see through the crisis of the moment. I'm starving here, universe. Help me. And the universe said, oh, don't worry. And the universe always says, don't worry, right? Because it has perspective. Our little guardian angels say, don't worry, you're going through a hard time. It's a test that you've brought to yourself to see if you're going to hang in there during these difficult times. You will. Everything will be okay. And you say, but hey, I've got one box of Kraft dinner on the shelf. It says, don't worry, you'll be taken care of. And sure enough, some amazing thing happens. By coincidence, we are led through these lives, and somehow we manage to survive.
You talk about the relationship between editors and writers. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that. I think that's so important, how they're led to each other. You talk about an idea being a magnet.
Sure.
And this magnet brings the writer and the editors together. Talk a bit about that. You say it very eloquently.
It is, the idea needs a circle of people in order to express itself. The center of the circle is the writer, of course. There's this wonderful idea. And then if the writer fulfills her job or his job, then that book is written, and it's a lovely book, successful book, lovely book. Now, how does it get out in the world? The next step is somehow it has to find an editor. And it'll go through, at least for me, go through a number of people before finally someone says, I love this book. I love this book. And they will stand up in an editorial meeting at Macmillan or Harper or Simon & Schuster or whatever and say, look, I really don't care what you guys think. I'm going to publish. I love this book, and I'm going to publish it. And that's, in fact, exactly what happened with Seagull. Because Seagull had already been rejected at Macmillan by a different editor when Eleanor Frieda found the manuscript, and she said, I love this book. This is that the talking seagull, Eleanor? She said, yes, it's a talking seagull, and I'm going to publish it. Now leave me alone. And it needed that voice, that editor's voice, to stand up for it. And sure enough, they left her alone. They said, well, okay, keep it cheap, Eleanor. It's going to fail. She said, it's not going to fail.
Isn't that amazing how somebody can become a champion of
Yes.
somebody's work, and because they are championing it, they're bringing it through, and they